Subnautica is going through it right now. Unknown Worlds, the studio behind the Subnautica franchise, was supposed to launch Subnautica 2 this year, and instead their billion-dollar owners Krafton fired the studio's original leadership team, installed their own CEO in their place, and have now delayed the game until 2026. There's rumors that this was done in order to not pay out a $250 million bonus to the studio. Two of the co-founders are now filing a lawsuit, and Krafton has responded by publicly accusing them of not managing the project properly, even going so far as to say that one of them abandoned development to go make movies in Hollywood. And the craziest part? Yeah, apparently that actually happened. There's now images circulating online of AI-generated movie posters this guy was making, and he even has podcasts where he openly admits that he's over game dev and happy to focus on something else. This whole thing is messy, but what's even messier is the absolute whiplash going on in game journalism. People immediately siding with the developers. There have been calls to boycott Subnautica 2 so Krafton doesn't make any money, but as time passes and more information has begun to leak out, it seems that maybe, just maybe, these beloved indie darlings aren't telling the whole truth. I mean, they did sell their studio for $500 million 4 years ago, so are they even indie anymore? Or are these guys just full-on AAA execs? The founders quite literally became multi-millionaires overnight, and, well, that type of money kind of changes people. So today, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about greed in the game industry, and we're going to ask you to try and be as open-minded as possible, okay? It's not black and white. It's not corporate man bad, indie man good, and I know it's really easy to get caught up and pick a side here, but at the end of the day, we're all just consumers. So let's just try to find out what's really going on. Nobody is asking the real questions here. What actually happens when you sell off your indie studio? Why was Unknown Worlds even valued at $500 million? Why were they also given a $250 million bonus opportunity? Do these numbers make sense? Are they even responsible? What happens to a studio and the games they make when that type of financial pressure is applied? We're also going to talk about early access. How does an indie early access title differ from an established franchise's early access? What expectations are there? And what happens to a game when it fails to meet those expectations? And finally, I want to reiterate that I'm not here to say that the billion-dollar international gaming conglomerate is in the right, but instead, just propose the idea that the people who sold their studio's future for $500 million might not be your best friends either. Maybe everyone is to blame. Money changes people, and unfortunately the Subnautica community is finding that out firsthand. Over a decade ago, Subnautica launched into early access and almost immediately took off. The game combined open-world survival mechanics with the unknown that is the ocean, threw in a lot of unexpected horror, and blew up to the franchise we know today. But this wasn't the devs' first game. The studio behind it, Unknown Worlds Entertainment, had been working for years on games like Natural Selection, a total conversion mod for Half-Life, but it's hard to make money in game dev, especially if you're only making mods. Although originally founded by Charlie Cleveland and Max McGuire, in 2011, Unknown Worlds sold a 40% minority stake of their company to Perfect World, a Chinese mass media company, for over 10 million renminbi, or about $1.5 million. With this new injection of cash to help fund development, in 2012, Natural Selection 2 was released, and as a standalone game, sold nearly 200,000 copies and made $1 million in the first week, eventually peaking at around 10,000 concurrent players. Overall, this was a very successful first attempt at selling real games, and Perfect World seemed to have noticed. Charlie and Max sold an additional 20% of their company in 2013 for just over 5 million renminbi, or around $700,000. This was a nice chunk of change, but it did raise Perfect World's shares to 60%, making them the majority shareholder of Unknown Worlds Entertainment, or, in other words, the owners. This is a very important distinction to make, okay? When all this drama started happening and Charlie made a very emotional goodbye post on the Subnautica subreddit, he said this: "After all these years, to find out that I'm no longer able to work at the company I started stings." Now, yes, Charlie did start Unknown Worlds over 20 years ago, but as of 2013, it wasn't his company anymore. He was actually an employee of Perfect World. That's what it means for them to be a majority shareholder. And most likely, the ownership split between himself and the other co-founder, Max McGuire, meant that he probably had more like a 20% ownership of the studio. This is the unfortunate reality of game development. It is hard to self-fund, and I don't think that we can look back at Charlie and Max and blame them for selling shares of the company to fund development, but this was very obviously a predatory deal. I personally find it insane that someone would sell off more than half of their company to a Chinese media conglomerate for quick cash. To me, that doesn't make any sense, but I wasn't in their position at the time. Maybe Natural Selection 2 didn't fund enough, and although $1 million in a week does seem good, maybe it didn't actually make up for what they personally invested into it. There's a lot of variables here, but the point is, as of 12 years ago, Unknown Worlds was not Charlie's company. It was Perfect World's company. As Charlie and Max moved on from Natural Selection 2, the beginnings of Subnautica began development. By 2014, the first early access version hit Steam, and later that year, the studio hired Ted Gill to assist. These three, Charlie, Max, and Ted, are known as the original lead developers of the Subnautica franchise for this reason. In 2018, when Subnautica left early access and officially launched into 1.0, it exploded, reaching over 50,000 concurrent players. Later that year, Ted Gill became the president and CEO of the studio, and Unknown Worlds was rolling. Within 2 years, the game had sold over 5 million copies, and honestly, it's well deserved. The game itself is timeless, there's no microtransactions, no expansion packs, no DLC, and even without all these methods to squeeze out every last dollar from consumers, it's estimated that the game made nearly $300 million just on Steam alone, with the studio netting around $80 million of that after taxes, fees, and everything else. Unknown Worlds had made a breakout hit, and the studio reorganized for that reason. Ted would oversee the general day-to-day business of the studio as the president and CEO. Charlie could focus on further Subnautica franchise development as game director and creative lead, and Max would be the technical director for the team. By 2021, the sequel Below Zero released, and although the community may not have enjoyed it as much as the previous game, it still sold extremely well, topping out at nearly 3 million sales across all platforms. In fact, Unity, yes, the game engine Unity, even published a case study on Subnautica and Subnautica Below Zero on their ports to Switch because of how successful they were. Just a few months after the launch of Sub-Zero, the multi-billion-dollar Korean video game publisher Krafton, primarily known for PUBG, announced that they had acquired Unknown Studios in a $750 million deal. $500 million was to go to Perfect Worlds, technical director Max McGuire, and others, as the official notice stated, with $250 million in an earn-out provision due in 2026, depending on Unknown Worlds' achievement after merger. Prior to this, Perfect World did sell the majority of their shares to an undisclosed entity, but that doesn't appear to have changed the leadership back to any of the original founders. Now, for argument's sake, let's just make this simple and say that Perfect World still owns 60% of Unknown Worlds, and let's say that the two co-founders, Charlie and Max, owned 15%, and then Ted owned 10%. 60, 15, 15, 10, okay? Pretty reasonable assumption with how leadership is split in business. This means that Charlie and Max potentially made $75 million on the sale of the studio, while Ted earned $50 million. Once again, this isn't confirmed. I'm not saying they actually made that, just trying to make an argument here. Please don't sue me, Charlie, okay? But theoretically, within 9 years, Charlie went from selling a portion of his studio for $1 million to making tens of millions of dollars with the sales of Subnautica, to then making nearly $100 million by selling his game studio while he still worked there and earned a salary. Now, I'm not saying this is bad or that he doesn't deserve this. I think Subnautica is very clearly one of the best indie games over the past 10 years, and they earned every bit of the money they made. But what I'm trying to say is that although Subnautica started indie, the studio was very much making AAA budget money soon after. This isn't a struggling game dev studio. This isn't some dude living out of his car coding just to buy food. This is a franchise and a studio that was valued at nearly $1 billion. $500 million up front and $250 million if they hit certain financial targets. When it comes to acquisitions, Valuations are a very tricky thing. You not only want to value the company on what they've done up to the point of sale, but you also want to paint a very positive picture of the company's financial future so you can make the most money when you sell it. And you also want to make the buyers think they'll make even more money years later. It really comes down to straight greed. A valuation of $750 million for Unknown Worlds is insanity. For comparison's sake, this is more than Sony paid for Insomniac Games, who made the Spyro, Ratchet & Clank, and Spider-Man series. With this valuation, the owners of Unknown Worlds more than likely made a very good case that Subnautica had done extremely well, Sub-Zero was going to do just as well if not better, Subnautica 2 was going to be massive, and this would turn a one-off indie hit into a blockbuster billion-dollar franchise. And furthermore, aside from just Subnautica, Unknown Worlds had a secret. They were developing a brand new IP and were finally going to introduce a live service game with microtransactions and long-lasting monetization potential. Moonbreaker. Now, if you've never heard of Moonbreaker, that's because it absolutely failed. After the acquisition of Unknown Worlds in 2021, Moonbreaker officially entered early access. It was supposed to be a turn-based competitive tabletop-like game where players could buy figurine packs, assemble teams, paint them, and battle. It was a bit like a digital Warhammer game or other tabletop mini-figurine games. The idea was unique, and the entire universe was even created with the help of Brandon Sanderson, a fantasy sci-fi author best known for Mistborn, and in 2022 had a novel series Kickstarter backed by over $40 million. That is a record. Literally, no other Kickstarter in the history of the website has had more than the person who designed the universe for the game Moonbreaker. This guy is legit, and people loved his work. But people did not love Moonbreaker. As of recording this, there are literally 0 people in game, with a 24-hour peak of 3 and an all-time peak of less than 1,000. That is borderline Concord levels of failure. It officially launched into 1.0 in February 2024, and, well, yeah, the results speak for themselves. Complaints of lack of content and not much to do after the initial purchase, and unlocks meant that there was no real reason to keep playing and no reason to buy packs. You can't have a live service game with microtransactions if literally nobody is playing it. So that brings us back to the valuation of Unknown Worlds as a studio. When Krafton purchased them back in 2021, Moonbreaker would have already been in development. This would have been a huge selling point to a company like Krafton, not only because they were going to buy that blockbuster franchise in Subnautica, but this soon-to-be brand new hit IP from a dev team that people loved. It would be monetized from day one. This type of financial expectations are baked into that original valuation of $750 million for the company, as well as the revenue expectations for the next 5 years. With Krafton acquiring Unknown Worlds in 2021 and Moonbreaker's early access set for the next year, they would have expected to see immediate return while money came in from Sub-Zero and the devs continued to work on Subnautica 2. Now, obviously, none of that happened. Moonbreaker was an absolute flop. So what does the studio do now? Well, you have to try and then make your money back, because as of right now, this investment to Krafton is not paying off. With sales numbers coming out that Subnautica Below Zero was selling roughly half as much as the original title, and the new IP, which was supposed to provide long-term income, being dead on arrival, all of the focus was going to have to be on Subnautica 2. This is a real problem with the valuation here, and I think both Krafton and Unknown Worlds' leadership team should really share the blame on this one. Krafton saw Unknown Worlds as a gold mine and overpaid in hopes to secure the bag and milk it for all it's worth, while Unknown Worlds saw Krafton as someone who would be more than happy to write essentially what was a blank check and give them hundreds and millions of dollars. Everyone was happy here because of the money involved initially, but now there's expectations. You have to live up to this valuation, otherwise you're going to have problems. If Sub-Zero doesn't sell as well or better than the original, well, now we have to fix that. Our investors are wondering what's going on. If Moonbreaker flops, how do we explain years of development costs essentially disappearing overnight? After 2 years of owning Unknown Worlds, the only hope Krafton has left lies in Subnautica 2. If you're a developer, you know that you need to make up for years of less than expected revenue just to make this worth your owner's time, or they're going to make some massive changes to your studio because you're not making them any money. How does this type of financial pressure change the dynamic of game development? Well, one of the most noteworthy examples of this recently was with a game called Hytale, which was canceled after a decade of development. The original creator of the game made a tweet reflecting on what happened, and he had to say this about what he felt when the studio he founded was eventually sold to Riot. The pressure of having the Riot Games label and mega viral trailer, bigger funding, and higher expectations made us all doubt ourselves back then. On a personal level, I couldn't live up to these new high expectations and was given an option to leave by Riot. The team was so good that I felt like an imposter at that point. Given my limited real game development experience, it was good for me to leave, and I agreed. Even still today, I agree with that decision, and I completely understand how that came to be. I wanted to give the team a better chance of success and not hold them back. Money changes things, and it changed Simon's relationship with the game that he had been making for years, the studio he founded. The moment you get that huge investment, you're no longer a group of friends happily coding and testing new things out with your community. You're trying to live up to the expectations of that investment. In terms of Hytale, Simon couldn't handle the pressure and had to leave for his own sanity, and I'm sure other developers felt this pressure as well. With Unknown Worlds, the entire acquisition was now basically hinging on the success of Subnautica 2. And this is where we start getting conflicting media reports. When Krafton announced that the leadership of Unknown Worlds would be replaced, Charlie made an emotional post to Subnautica subreddit, and I won't read the whole thing, but he had this to say about Subnautica 2. The game is ready for early access release, and we know you're ready to play it. And while we thought this was going to be our decision to make, at least for now, that decision is in Krafton's hands. So immediately, Charlie says the game is ready for early access, and at this point, the community is bummed out, but they're cautiously optimistic. But a week later, the gameplay trailer drops, and at the end, it's revealed that Subnautica 2 would enter early access in 2026. This immediately goes against what Charlie said, and the community believes, trusts, and loves Charlie. So now this is a PR battle. The big, bad international billionaires have just fired Charlie, and they have delayed his game. In an article by Kotaku's Ethan Gatch titled, "Report, Subnautica 2 team could miss $250 million payout after publisher delays it to 2026 against the founder's wishes," he writes, Bloomberg reports that Unknown Worlds would get the whopping payout if it hits certain revenue goals in 2025, which it's unlikely to do now that Krafton has delayed Subnautica 2's recently confirmed early access launch for later this year. That delay came against the wishes of studio co-founders Charlie Cleveland, Max McGuire, and CEO Ted Gill, all of whom the publisher fired last week and replaced Striking Distance Studios CEO Steve Papoutsis. According to a live recording of an all-hands meeting reviewed by Bloomberg, Papoutsis was asked about the firing's delay in payout by other developers at the studio. While yes, the software that everybody worked on is in a great spot and it felt like, hey, we should launch this, that wasn't where both parties aligned around, he said during the meeting. On the question of whether Krafton delayed the game to avoid paying the studio the bonuses, Papoutsis responded, "It's never been told to me that we're making this change specifically to impact any earnout or anything like that. The money would have reportedly been paid out to the staff on the studio floor, including hundreds of thousands in bonuses for some on the roughly 100-person team." Now, unsurprisingly, when the media pushes a narrative that a soulless corporation is stealing $250 million from an indie dev, a beloved indie dev and his team, the community will not respond positively. There were endless boycott Subnautica 2 posts on Reddit, and everyone seemingly rallied behind Charlie. Of course they did. He's the only one that they've trusted for years. But in response to this narrative, Krafton published an official statement, and it's actually a forced pop-up if you were to go to their website right now. In it, they specify that 90% of the $250 million earnout compensation was allocated to the three executives, Charlie, Max, and Ted, with the expectation that they would demonstrate leadership and active involvement in the development of Subnautica 2. However, regrettably, the former leadership abandoned their responsibilities entrusted to them. Subnautica 2 was originally planned for an early access launch in early 2024, but the timeline has since been significantly delayed. Krafton made multiple requests to Charlie and Max to resume their roles as game director and technical director, respectively, but both declined to do so. In particular, following the failure of Moonbreaker, Krafton asked Charlie to devote himself to the development of Subnautica 2. However, instead of participating in the game development, he chose to focus on a personal film project. Krafton believes that the absence of core leadership has resulted in repeated confusion in direction and significant delays in the overall project schedule. The current early access version also falls short in terms of content volume. We are deeply disappointed by the former leadership's conduct, and above all, we feel a profound sense of betrayal by their failure to honor the trust placed in them by our fans. This is an insane statement. It is huge, and I don't think people really realize what it takes for a company of their size to literally air out dirty laundry, but also for a Korean company to do it. I lived in China for 3 years working in an international consulting company, and I will say that in Asia, outright disrespect like this is not a common thing. If someone who's more familiar with like Korean customs wants to correct me on this, please do. I'll see the comment, but you would never see something like this in a Chinese business environment, and I would assume most Asian business environments, unless someone did something that was so bad it made the other person lose massive face. This is a hugely disrespectful statement from Krafton, meant to show that Charlie is wrong. And not only is he wrong, what he's doing is misrepresenting the company in such a horrible way. You do not say something like this in Asia unless you have the receipts. So the biggest question mark here is the accusation that Charlie ran off to make a movie instead of leading the development of Subnautica. And as strange as it sounds, that is apparently true. So Charlie has a website where it states that he wants to make daring and immersive sci-fi films like Aliens and The Matrix, but he's starting off with 3 smaller movies first: a Christmas comedy, a zombie movie with a twist, and a movie we're not ready to announce yet. I don't know how I went from never working on a movie to working on 3 simultaneously, but that's Tinseltown for you. This has been accompanied by a podcast, and the whole thing is, in his words, bringing video game early access to Hollywood. On his own website, in its About Me section, he says this: "I'm Charlie Cleveland and I've been designing video games for over 25 years. I founded Unknown Worlds and built games like Natural Selection, Natural Selection 2, Subnautica, and Moonbreaker. I absolutely love making games, but wanted to try something new. At the end of 2023, I left San Francisco after almost 20 years and moved to Los Angeles to reset my life. Instead of taking it easy, I now find myself working on multiple film projects. It's amazing how fast it's all happening. Being right in the thick of things makes it so much easier to meet like-minded people." Do you see what I mean when I said that this is messy and that I don't think anybody here is your friend? Charlie, for the past couple weeks, has been making very emotional Reddit posts on a community that loves him for the game he made. And he's been trying to play the role as the victim, the good guy Subnautica dev who got canned by Big Bad Krafton. In his own words, on his own website, he moved away from where the studio was. He literally moved cities and reset his life to begin focusing on making 3 full-length feature films. He's now suing Krafton for the $250 million, and I don't want to assume what's going to happen here, but I think the only real reason he's suing is to hope that there's going to be some type of settlement that comes out of this. From what we can see, based on the publicly available information from Charlie himself, he hasn't been involved in Subnautica 2 development for at least the last 2 years. How would he know that the game was ready for early access? He's been in LA making 3 movies. A few days ago, there was also leaked internal documents which Krafton confirmed were legit. Take that as you will. Maybe Krafton leaked them on purpose to save face. Maybe they made them up entirely. But either way, it's a slideshow stating that Subnautica 2's development was not yet good enough for early access. Now, I don't want to show them since I have a feeling this lawsuit is going to get messy, so feel free to Google it on your own. But basically, the slide stated that there wasn't enough content. There was maybe 8 hours or so of gameplay, only just a couple biomes, and none of the newer gameplay features like automation that they had been working on. Now, I think we can all agree that huge megacorps like Krafton make games worse by continually forcing microtransactions and live service. just to make shareholder value go up. But we should also agree that maybe, just maybe, sometimes game development doesn't go as planned, and people who have already made hundreds of millions of dollars, like Charlie, maybe they can start to lose focus. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that after 10 years of working on Subnautica and 4 to 5 years of working on Moonbreaker, which flopped, maybe he would want to do more fun things like making movies in Hollywood. But as he started making movies in Hollywood and was letting the studio develop Subnautica 2, time was still ticking on this bonus from the original acquisition. 2025 rolls around and the studio is now looking to cash in on the $250 million by releasing Subnautica 2 into early access, but Krafton doesn't think that's acceptable. The leadership of Charlie, Max, and Ted, in hopes to secure their bonus, want to move forward with early access, but Krafton disagrees and puts in a new CEO that can actually make the game good. Yes, they don't have to pay out $250 million, but they're not doing it for simply no reason. They're doing it because the investment did not end up being worth the extra $250 million. Krafton isn't stealing money from these guys. These guys didn't earn it. And now, with a new CEO, Krafton can at least try and make a good game without having to worry about a leadership team that may have only been making decisions based on immediate financial benefits, not long-term success of the game or the franchise or even the studio. This is not a good situation for anyone, but the reality is that early access when you're an indie studio is way different than when you're an established studio, especially if that game is going to be a sequel. And not even just a sequel, but the third installment of the franchise. In 2014, it was acceptable for Subnautica to release with just a few creatures, a couple biomes, a few tools, and a gameplay loop that was just okay. It was an unknown game, and the devs were a small team that would go on to spend 4 years building it in early access with the community to 1.0. Subnautica 2, however, was going to be built on a completely new engine. It wasn't going to be Unity, but Unreal Engine 5, and it was supposed to be an evolution of the series. If we believe the internal document that was leaked and confirmed by Krafton, then if Subnautica 2 were to release today, the game would have had just a handful of creatures, a couple biomes, and none of the new gameplay mechanics that would have separated it from the original. This would have been a PR disaster. Players would have considered it a cheap cash grab, and the entire Subnautica franchise would be in jeopardy. We just have to look at Kerbal Space Program 2's early access launch to see what happens when a sequel goes horribly wrong. Yes, there were other problems with the project itself, but the early access launch was so bare bones that it essentially killed all momentum the IP had. Within a couple years, the studio closed, the game is sitting at overwhelmingly negative on Steam, and Valve has to attach a warning on the Steam store page saying that it hasn't been updated in over a year. At this point, Krafton is protecting their investment. They went into this acquisition with the belief that the original Unknown Worlds leadership team would continue to provide them with the past financial success the studio had, plus additional success with the inclusion of a new IP and the expansion of the Subnautica franchise. Neither of those things are happening, so Krafton is left holding the bag. Subnautica 2 is currently the second most wishlisted game on Steam. If Krafton nails this launch, they know they can make their money back. Finally, they've been bleeding from this acquisition for years. Of course, why wouldn't they want to be careful about it? Now, are we ever going to find out what actually happened during development of Subnautica 2 and all the stuff behind the scenes in Unknown Worlds from Sub-Zero, Moonbreaker, and current development? Probably not, but the point I'm trying to make here today is this. Games are an amazing escape from reality. They're something that some people even base their entire personality on, but that doesn't mean we have to blindly believe the people that made them. They aren't your friends. They're in it for business reasons, and just like people can create parasocial relationships with content creators, streamers, random celebrities, whoever, that happens in game development too, all the time. You see the person that made the game that you love, and you want to believe that that person has your best interest at heart. But there is a very real point in game development where, unfortunately, business takes center stage, and money makes people do really weird things. It makes people sell their life's work to a Chinese media company. It makes people abandon the game they love to run away to Hollywood to make a Christmas movie. And it makes companies Like Krafton put unrealistic pressure on development teams to keep making the line go up for their investors. Krafton was wrong for valuing Unknown Worlds as highly as they did and expecting to squeeze out every single last penny from them, but Charlie and Max were just as wrong for selling their company to China 10 years ago, and then cashing a huge check and taking a cushy exec job when it was sold again in 2021. If they really wanted that $250 million bonus for them and their dev team, they would have worked harder on making Moonbreaker a better game. Truth hurts, but it was not worth the value that Krafton paid. And if they really wanted that bonus, then Charlie would have stayed in San Francisco for the last 2 years, grinding it out to make sure that Subnautica 2 hit its deadline. Unfortunately, everyone here is greedy, and I really hope that Subnautica 2 doesn't suffer for it. Well, that's it for me. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more news on Unknown Worlds and Subnautica 2, but I hope this helped give you a better idea of the history that got these guys to where they are today. And I really did try to be as unbiased as possible and back that up with actual news reports, SEC filings, data. So what do you guys think? Are the devs right? Is Krafton right? Do they all suck? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up and share it with a buddy. On this channel, I like to look at game industry news, headlines, recent game releases, and try to give a little bit more analysis and context. So I hope you guys enjoyed. But until next time, peace.